Hi, I'm Dr. Robyn Koslowitz, YouTube's post-traumatic parenting expert. Here's why I do not believe in the concept of big T and little t trauma. If you like this content, if you like what we're talking about, please subscribe, hit the subscribe button below. You can also find the post-traumatic parenting community on Instagram and Facebook, and you can find the post-traumatic parenting podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please check out at Dr. Koslowitz Psychology on Instagram for all of the post-traumatic parenting content. So here's why I do not believe in the concept of big T and little t trauma. So often people use this concept to differentiate between these traumas that are huge, like the death of a parent, being incarcerated in threat of your life, being in a car accident, being in a fire, those kinds of big T traumas from little t traumas like moving, like living in a home with a chronically ill parent, like being bullied. And I think that this distinction is absolutely ridiculous. I call the thinking behind this distinction trauma poker, which is a game that no one can ever win. It's the game where we play and someone says, I see your history of being bullied and fat shamed in childhood, and I will raise you, my stepdad who beat me. I see your stepdad who beat you, and I will raise you almost dying in a car accident, right? And what happens with trauma poker is we keep upping the ante. No one wins. First of all, very often what is traumatic about a traumatic experience might not be the experience itself. It might be the sequelae of the experience, what happened before, what happened after, the implications, where it went in our psyche. So for example, for me, losing my father was traumatic. Doing CPR on my father as he was dying was traumatic. It definitely created PTSD and actual physical flashbacks. And living with a chronically ill father my whole life, watching him have multiple heart attacks my whole life, was equally and if not more traumatic because of the age at which that happened and because of the beliefs about myself and the world that those engendered. Very often after a major loss or after a major illness, there are all sorts of implications. Perhaps the remaining parent is now very preoccupied and busy trying to keep body and soul together, trying to keep the family alive, and can't be as present as they used to be. When somebody's been bullied, maybe it's not just the incident of bullying, even if it's extreme humiliation in front of the school. Think, that scene in Carrie where she's humiliated in front of the whole school. Maybe it's coming to school the next day, right? Remembering it, thinking about it. So the distinction of big T and little t trauma is meaningless because it's not the experience, it's our experience of our experience that matters in trauma. Just because an experience is ranked by a jury of our peers as, yeah, that would be traumatic, doesn't make it the most traumatic experience, right? And just because an experience doesn't sound all that bad on paper, doesn't mean that that experience wasn't extremely traumatic and extremely difficult. It's very often not what happens. It's how we experience it, how our brain metabolizes it, how alone we felt, how overwhelming and huge the emotions around it were. I also don't like the game of trauma poker because very often, especially in post-traumatic parenting classes, people are telling one tip of the iceberg of their trauma. Like this is the part of their trauma that they're comfortable sharing, but really there's a whole other story and many other things that happened that were more traumatic or that are very tender memories that they're not comfortable talking about. So just because someone is saying like, oh yeah, I had a trauma, but it's a big T trauma or it's a little T trauma, I don't think it rises to the level of big T trauma. I don't always necessarily think that way. I certainly believe we can never make that determination about another person's trauma. We don't know what their experience was. We didn't live it. If a memory is difficult to grapple with, if a situation is something that your brain keeps rehearsing, if you're triggered by life events that other people seem to take in stride, You're traumatized. You don't need some abstract scale telling you, yes, this event was definitely traumatic enough to constitute a trauma, and this event was not. There's no one in an ivory tower, there's no research team that can tell you about the reality of your experience. Because I will tell you from my own PTSD history, it's the memories that don't make their way into the PTSD story. For example, realizing that my father was so desperately critically ill at such a young age that were actually more traumatic than the traumatic event itself. The problem is, of course, with CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, is very often it isn't the one discrete trauma. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of incidents of emotional neglect, emotional abuse, physical abuse, situations where our brain doesn't even think about them because sadly, they're so normal, right? It's sort of like if I ask you what you ate for lunch 3 weeks ago or what you wore 2 weeks ago, you're not going to remember because your brain didn't encode that information. It's not all that important, right? So unless you like had coveted tickets to like the hottest restaurant in town 2 weeks ago, and that's where you ate lunch, you're not going to remember, right? Because your brain didn't encode it. Our brains tend to encode the kind of information that would make their way into the headlines of a newspaper, right? And that's why, of course, dog bites man, not news. Man bites dog is news, right? Because it's unusual, it's new, it's novel. Sadly, with CPTSD, some of the experiences we had in our childhood happened every single day. So we can't necessarily remember the discrete incident. I cannot tell you the discrete day and moment I saw my father clutch his chest, right? He did that. That happened daily, right? So living in the shadow of illness was something that I lived with. So I can't give you those discrete incidents because it was like the death of 1,000 cuts, right? In that way, that is why trauma poker doesn't make sense with CPTSD. And that is why big T and little t trauma doesn't make sense. I had someone who, when I asked her about her trauma, on her intake to therapy, she said, being raised by my mother. Right now, there's a lot to unpack in that statement. There's a lot in that sentence. But would someone on some list of big T versus little t traumas put that on the big T list or the little t list, right? So it doesn't make sense to think in terms of big T, little t. It makes sense to think about, was there an experience that was too big for your brain to metabolize? Did that experience leave you feeling unsafe in the world, leaving you feeling unsure of whether or not you have the tools to cope with this world, whether or not you are going to be able to handle future threats that come up? Were the emotions so big your brain just couldn't metabolize them? Were the thoughts around it, the cognitions around it, too big for your brain to process? Congratulations, you're traumatized. No one gets to tell you whether it was big T or little t. No one gets to doubt your experience of your experience. This is your trauma, right? It's you who has to live with the flashbacks. It's you who has to live with the persistent recurring thoughts. It's you who has to live with the rumination. It's you who has to live with the sense of dysregulation. It's you who has to live with your triggers, right? So it's your trauma. No one, no researcher, no PhD like me, no one gets to say what was or wasn't traumatic, right? That is our story. It is our narrative. If we are going to be able to relate to our trauma and use it in a way that allows us to live a life worth living, then we have to take ownership of that trauma narrative. And that means no one else gets to. So never doubt yourself again. Never play trauma poker against yourself. Never say to yourself, I don't know why I developed PTSD. After all, people have been through worse and they're fine. First of all, we don't know that. We don't know what goes on inside their head. A lot of people coping with trauma are like ducks, right? Ducks look like they're serenely floating on the surface of the lake, but under the water, their legs are pedaling madly. Just because someone else seems fine after having gone through worse does not mean that they actually are fine. And it doesn't mean that they've been through worse, right? Because there's no such thing as big T versus little t trauma. There is only an experience that was too big for our brain to metabolize and our need to handle the sequelae of that. So if you have an experience that was too big for your brain to metabolize, congratulations, you're traumatized. Not sure what you win, but congratulations. Now our job is to reclaim our ability to live our life worth living, to move towards valued living with our traumas. But don't discount that you were traumatized. Don't start thinking in terms of big T, little t. Don't start playing trauma poker. It's a game that no one wins and it gets you nowhere. I know this is a controversial opinion. I'd love to hear in the comments below what you think about my belief that there's no such thing as big T versus little t trauma. So comment below. Remember, if you like this video, please click on the subscribe button. Check out the post-traumatic parenting community on Instagram. It's at Dr. Koslowitz Psychology. That's where the post-traumatic parenting can interact with each other, and we can have conversations about trauma and parenting and how they intersect. And of course, check out the post-traumatic parenting podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts.